If you were a Victorian in the mid-19th century, there's a good chance you were already tired before even lying down. The Industrial Revolution had transformed daily life into one long, noisy endurance test. Sleep wasn't just something you did at night. It became something people worried about, measured, and even moralized over. And the more they obsessed, the worse their sleep often became. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, how Victorians tried to sleep better and accidentally made it worse, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's rewind a bit. Before the Victorian period, sleep had always been a necessity, not a hobby. Medieval peasants weren't staying up late worrying about optimizing their resume cycles. They were simply grateful to collapse after a day of hauling hay, dodging plagues, and trying not to anger the local lord. But by the 1800s, a new social class emerged, the Victorian middle class, with their clocks, their gas lamps, and their newfound fondness for scientific self-improvement. They began treating sleep less like a human need and more like a mysterious riddle that needed solving. And the riddle was, why can't anyone get any rest? The answer had a lot to do with the Industrial Revolution. Cities were suddenly loud, bright, and filthy. Imagine trying to nod off while horse-drawn omnibuses rattled over cobblestones, factory whistles shrieked at midnight, and your neighbor's coal fire pumped smoke into your bedroom. Gaslighting, celebrated as a modern marvel, was both a blessing and a curse. Streets were lit up at all hours, which meant people started staying up later than ever before. Great for nightlife, terrible for circadian rhythms. Darkness, once a natural bedtime cue, was now negotiable. Victorians were learning for the first time what it meant to lie in bed at midnight, eyes wide open, staring at the flickering glow seeping through their curtains. Doctors naturally weighed in, and because Victorian doctors loved to make everything about morality, they warned that bad sleep wasn't just inconvenient, it was sinful. If you weren't getting your 8 hours, it might be because you were lazy, gluttonous, or had impure thoughts. In other words, even when you were unconscious, you could still be doing life wrong. Books and pamphlets popped up everywhere with titles like How to Secure Refreshing Slumber and The Science of Repose, turning bedtime into homework. One sleep manual even warned that staying up late could lead to nervous excitability and a shortened lifespan. Translation: forget partying, your pillow has a curfew. But here's the paradox. The more people tried to regulate their sleep, the harder it became to actually sleep. It's the classic problem of lying awake at night thinking, if I don't fall asleep in the next 5 minutes, tomorrow is ruined. Except Victorians did it with added pressure from science, medicine, and God himself. They wanted to rest peacefully, but they basically invented stress. This obsession spilled over into daily routines. Middle-class Victorians began to schedule their entire lives around the right time to sleep. Early rising was a badge of honor. Waking up before dawn proved you were disciplined, hard-working, and not at all a degenerate. Entire articles in Victorian magazines were devoted to the idea that waking up late made you morally weak. If you liked sleeping in, you weren't just lazy, you were a walking cautionary tale. Imagine your alarm clock doubling as a public shaming device. And let's not forget the cultural contradictions. On one hand, the Victorians were told sleep was vital to health, longevity, and morality. On the other, they were also told that too much sleep would rot the brain, weaken the will, and turn you into a social embarrassment. The result? Everyone second-guessed their bedtime. Were you getting too little? Too much? Not the right kind? It was the birth of what modern psychologists call sleep anxiety. And yes, the Victorians managed to invent it before Netflix and smartphones even existed. Of course, social class played its part. Wealthy Victorians had the luxury of worrying about whether their sleep was pure or scientific, while the working poor were often just collapsing whenever and wherever they could. Factory laborers, child workers, and domestic servants weren't exactly debating circadian rhythms. They were grateful for any shut-eye between 14-hour shifts. For them, the sleep obsession was a middle-class indulgence, another sign of how disconnected Victorian self-improvement culture was from the realities of daily survival. But it wasn't all bleak. The Victorian fascination with sleep did spark some genuine curiosity that nudged science forward. The period saw early studies of insomnia, theories about the stages of rest, and debates about whether humans were supposed to sleep in one solid block or in two phases, so-called first sleep and second sleep. For a brief moment, Victorians thought they might crack the code of slumber and finally master the mysterious third of life spent unconscious. Instead, they mostly mastered the art of worrying themselves awake. By the end of the century, magazines were filled with contradictory advice columns. Open your windows but don't let in a draft. Go to bed early but not too early. Sleep long but not too long. Rest your mind but don't overthink it. The Victorian sleep project had become an unsolvable puzzle, and the harder they tried, the worse they felt. So, in this age of gaslights, chiming clocks, and endless advice, one thing was certain: sleep was no longer just sleep. It was a moral battlefield, a scientific experiment, and a nightly reminder that Victorians could make even the simplest human activity unbearably complicated. When you picture a Victorian bedroom, chances are you imagine something grand, towering four-poster beds, heavy drapes, and furniture that looks like it could double as castle fortifications, and you wouldn't be far off. For the Victorians, beds weren't just for sleeping. They were declarations of wealth, morality, and personal hygiene, or at least the appearance of it. Welcome to the bed wars, where people fought not with swords, but with springs, stuffing, and a whole lot of unnecessary upholstery. Let's start with the basics, the four-poster bed. To us, they look romantic, curtains you can draw shut, posts that stretch up like something out of a Gothic novel. To Victorians, they were more than just cozy, they were symbols of status. A poor family might squeeze 5 people onto a straw mattress on the floor, but the middle classes wanted something that screamed, "Look at me, I've made it." A four-poster was like the Tesla of the 19th century, except instead of impressing your neighbors in traffic, you impressed them by inviting them into your bedroom. Yes, the Victorians did sometimes show off their beds to visitors. It was that important. But luxury has its downsides. Four-posters, with their elaborate curtains and hangings, were basically bug hotels. Every layer of fabric was a new potential hiding spot for lice, fleas, and the dreaded bedbug. Doctors eventually warned that all that drapery was less romantic canopy and more mobile infestation unit. Still, people clung to them for prestige, because what's a few hundred insects between friends if it means your bed looks like it belongs to royalty? This brings us to one of the great innovations of the age, the iron bedstead. By the mid-19th century, manufacturers began pushing iron and brass bed frames as the hygienic alternative to wood. No more crevices for bugs, no more rotting slats, no more infestations crawling down from the canopy to greet you at 2 a.m. Advertisements praised iron beds as the clean, modern, scientific solution. In reality, bedbugs are nothing if not resourceful, and they quickly proved that they could just as happily nest in the cracks of iron as they did in oak. Imagine spending a small fortune on an invincible bug-proof bed, only to discover the same tiny armies marching up your legs at night. It was the 19th century equivalent of buying the latest iPhone and realizing the battery still dies at 20%. Of course, the mattress was its own battlefield. If you were wealthy, you had choices: goose feathers for softness, horsehair for firmness, or in some cases seaweed. Yes, seaweed. Because apparently, nothing says luxury like smelling faintly of the ocean while you sleep. Feather mattresses sounded lovely in theory, but they tended to clump together, leaving you perched on one fluffy mountain while the rest of the bed felt like a barren desert. Horsehair was firmer, more durable, and conveniently gave you the experience of lying on what can only be described as a bristly doormat. Seaweed was cheaper, but it had the unfortunate tendency to, well, rot. Imagine drifting off to sleep surrounded by the aroma of yesterday's fish market. Romantic? Not exactly. And here's the kicker. Mattresses weren't standardized. Today you walk into a store and pick between soft, medium, and firm. Victorians didn't have that. They had the equivalent of mystery grab bags. Some were lumpy, some sagged in the middle, and some felt like sleeping on a sack of potatoes. Imagine trying to relax while lying on what feels like a lumpy haystack with opinions. That was the Victorian mattress experience in a nutshell. Naturally, bed manufacturers fought over who could market their designs as the healthiest. Feather beds were accused of suffocating sleepers. Horsehair was accused of harboring dampness. Even the supposedly modern spring mattress, which made its debut in the mid-1800s, got mixed reviews. Sure, it offered bounce and support, but it also squeaked with every movement. If you shared a bed, you were guaranteed to wake up the moment your partner so much as breathed heavily. Victorian couples, already discouraged from physical displays of affection, now had the added challenge of sleeping on what was essentially a noisy trampoline. Beds also became tied to morality. A tidy, well-made bed symbolized discipline and virtue. A messy one, that suggested sloth, poor character, or worse, moral corruption. Magazines reminded housewives that their family's virtue could be judged by the neatness of their sheets. Your bed wasn't just where you slept, it was an advertisement for your soul. And then there were children. In poor households, kids often slept 2 or 3 to a mattress or even shared the parents' bed. In wealthier homes, nurseries had smaller versions of the family bed, sometimes ornate mini four-posters, because nothing says childhood like being tucked into a bed frame heavier than you are. But perhaps the strangest part of the bed wars was how much innovation was dedicated to appearances rather than comfort. Decorative headboards, carved posts, brass knobs polished to a shine, all while the actual sleeping surface remained an uneven mess. It was less about rest and more about status. Because in Victorian society, the bed wasn't just where you closed your eyes at night. It was the centerpiece of the bedroom, a stage where your wealth and refinement were silently performed. So, did the Victorians win the bed wars? Hardly. They may have upgraded from straw pallets to ornate frames, but they were still plagued by bugs, lumps, and the occasional whiff of seaweed. For all their technological progress, sleep comfort lagged behind. They didn't just invent fancier beds, they invented fancier problems. If you were a Victorian, bedtime wasn't just about crawling into a mattress and hoping the bedbugs had the night off. It was also about wardrobe. And Victorians, being Victorians, didn't believe in doing anything simply. Even sleep required a costume change. Forget slipping into shorts and a t-shirt. Victorians went to bed looking like Dickens characters auditioning for a ghost story. Let's start with the nightgown. For men and women alike, the nightgown was the staple of Victorian sleepwear. But these weren't the silky body-hugging numbers Hollywood loves to put in period dramas. Oh no. A Victorian nightgown was essentially a white cotton tent with sleeves. It was practical, loose enough to allow movement, and most importantly, modest. Because heaven forbid you dream in an unchaste manner, men's nightshirts looked almost identical, which is why so many cartoons from the era show balding men running around in floor-length white shirts and floppy caps. The lack of differentiation between male and female sleepwear led to occasional comedic misunderstandings, but to the Victorians, that wasn't the point. The point was covering every inch of the body, even in unconsciousness. In a society obsessed with respectability, modesty didn't end when the candles went out. For women, lace trims and embroidery often added a touch of refinement, because even in bed you might still need to prove your middle-class status. The irony, of course, is that these embellishments were itchy and impractical. Imagine trying to fall asleep while decorative lace was stabbing you in the collarbone. That's Victorian fashion for you. Elegance first, comfort somewhere far down the list. And then there was the nightcap. Today, when we hear the word, we think of a little glass of brandy before bed. For Victorians, it was much more literal. Nightcaps were cloth caps worn on the head to keep warm and, crucially, to prevent drafts. Homes weren't centrally heated, so winter nights could feel like sleeping in an icebox. A snug cap was less about style and more about survival. Of course, the result was that entire families went to bed looking like they were rehearsing for a Christmas carol. Children in nightcaps, adults in nightcaps. If a burglar broke in at midnight, he probably assumed he'd stumbled into a rehearsal for a ghost play. The design of these caps varied. Some were simple skull caps, while others had long, drooping tails that dangled down the shoulder. These tails, while impractical, became iconic. They showed up in illustrations, theatre plays, and eventually cartoons. Nothing says asleep in the Victorian imagination quite like a guy in a floor-length shirt and a ridiculously long hat. Night clothes also had a distinctly practical side. Socks were often worn to bed since cold feet were believed to prevent sleep, and since this was the age of endless advice manuals, Victorians were frequently reminded that warm extremities equaled peaceful slumber. One 19th century guide even recommended sewing special bed socks made of wool, because if your toes were chilly you risked agitating the nervous system. Translation: frost-bitten feet give you nightmares. For the upper classes, bed attire could even include bed jackets, short garments meant to keep the shoulders warm while reading in bed. This was particularly important for women since bedtime reading was fashionable, and a true lady wouldn't want to risk catching a chill while working through her copy of Bleak House. It wasn't just about keeping warm, though. Sleepwear was tied to ideas of morality. A neat, clean nightgown suggested discipline and virtue. A torn or dirty one, that hinted at laziness and poor character. Victorians loved to judge, and they didn't stop at daytime clothes. Even unconscious respectability had to be maintained. Your nightgown was, in a way, your reputation washed, ironed, and displayed for family approval. Of course, not everyone could afford proper sleepwear. The poor often made do with patched-up day clothes or whatever rags could serve the purpose. But the growing middle class fueled a booming market for manufactured nightwear. By the late century, department stores were selling pre-made gowns in bulk, a sure sign that society had accepted sleepwear as an essential category of fashion. Nightwear also intersected with health advice. Doctors debated the best fabrics for sleep. Cotton was breathable but considered chilly. Flannel kept you warm but sometimes overheated. Silk was luxurious but, according to some experts, weakened the constitution. Translation: if you sleep fancy, your body gets spoiled. Every option came with an opinion, and Victorians loved opinions almost as much as they loved lace. There was also the matter of propriety within families. In households with live-in servants, modest nightwear wasn't just about warmth. It was about ensuring no one saw anything scandalous if a servant entered the room unexpectedly. Curtains, caps, and long gowns formed layers of Victorian chastity armor, ensuring that bedtime was as respectable as afternoon tea. By the end of the century, pajamas borrowed from India through colonial influence began to creep into English bedrooms. Looser, two-piece sets appealed to men in particular, though nightshirts remained popular well into the 20th century. Still, the arrival of pajamas hinted at a slow evolution from the old ghostly Victorian look towards something more modern. But in the heyday of Queen Victoria, the bedtime uniform was unmistakable. Long gowns, warm socks, bed jackets, and caps that made you look like you were either leading a carol or haunting the place. In their quest for warmth, respectability, and just a hint of middle-class pride, Victorians turned sleep into a nightly costume drama. So while today we toss on sweatpants or old band t-shirts, Victorians approached bedtime as if they were suiting up for battle. A battle, specifically against cold drafts, bad reputations, and the horrifying prospect of being caught in anything less than proper attire, even when unconscious. If you were a Victorian heading to bed, the real danger wasn't nightmares or bedbugs, it was your own bedroom. In their endless quest to perfect the art of sleep, Victorians transformed their sleeping quarters into plush little caves of fabric and furnishings. And while all those carpets, curtains, and heavy drapes may have looked cozy, they were essentially health hazards disguised as decor. To step into a Victorian bedroom was to step into a velvet-wrapped Petri dish. Let's start with the curtains. Victorians loved them. The thicker, the heavier, the better. Curtains were meant to block drafts, shut out the gas lamps glowing from the street, and give an air of privacy and respectability. A respectable family didn't just have curtains, they had layers of curtains, sheer inner drapes, thick outer drapes, sometimes even pelmets, that extra decorative flap across the top like a hat for your window. To a modern eye, they look luxurious. To a modern doctor, they look like allergy season waiting to happen. But curtains were only the beginning. Bedrooms were covered, and I mean covered in fabric. Carpets stretched across floors that had once been bare boards. Rugs layered over carpets, creating plush little traps for soot and germs. Upholstered chairs, padded headboards, tasseled cushions. Every surface seemed to demand fabric. It was a kind of textile arms race. The more layers you had, the wealthier you looked. Bare wood was a sign of poverty. A well-off Victorian bedroom, on the other hand, looked like it had been swallowed whole by a curtain shop. Unfortunately, the Industrial Revolution made all that fabric less cozy and more hazardous. Victorian cities were choking with soot and smoke from coal fires and factories. Fine black dust crept in through every crack, every open window, and of course settled into the folds of those beautiful heavy curtains. Add in the fact that people rarely washed such bulky fabrics. Laundry was back-breaking work, and no one was about to wash a carpet the size of a horse, and you had a recipe for misery. Dust mites feasted, soot lingered. Every sneeze in the household had a good chance of being caused by the bedroom itself. And it wasn't just dust. Victorians had a growing awareness of germs thanks to pioneers like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, but their domestic habits didn't always keep pace. Thick carpets and drapery trapped not only soot but also the bacteria and spores that thrived in the damp, unventilated air of London bedrooms. Think of it as early DIY germ incubation. Your bedchamber smelled like progress, if progress also smelled like tuberculosis. Speaking of air, Victorians were terrified of drafts. A draft wasn't just a mild inconvenience, it was thought to cause colds, fevers, and even death. So while doctors were beginning to recommend fresh air, ordinary people doubled down on sealing themselves in with fabric fortresses. Windows stayed tightly closed, blocked by heavy curtains. Entire families slept in air that had been recycled for hours, stale and sometimes damp. Combine this with gas lighting that consumed oxygen and produced fumes, and you can see why some Victorians literally suffocated in their quest for coziness. And let's not forget the wallpaper. Victorians adored ornate, colourful wallpaper, often with intricate floral patterns. Unfortunately, many wallpapers were dyed with arsenic-based pigments, especially the popular shade known as Scheele's green. While a bright green parlour might look fashionable, the pigment could release toxic dust into the air. Imagine lying in bed surrounded by arsenic-coated walls, breathing deeply of good taste. Sweet dreams. The clutter didn't help either. Victorian bedrooms were rarely minimalist. Tables, chairs, dressers, and ornamented knickknacks filled every corner. Porcelain figurines, lace doilies, framed pictures, and hair wreaths. Yes, actual wreaths made from human hair as mementos of loved ones, all gathered dust. The result was a perfect storm of poor ventilation and endless surfaces for grime. Even the beds themselves joined the conspiracy. While we've already covered their structure and mattresses in another chapter, here we can note how they interacted with the room environment. Beds were often surrounded by thick drapery and hangings, turning them into miniature tents. These may have looked dramatic, but they also trapped every cough, every whiff of coal smoke, every exhaled germ. If one person in the household caught a cold, the bed curtains made sure everyone else would too. Ironically, while Victorians thought all this decoration made them safer, warmer against drafts, cleaner against pests, it often had the opposite effect. Doctors who visited homes sometimes warned patients that their bedrooms were literally making them sick. But changing fashions is hard, and no one wanted to be the first to strip the curtains from their windows and risk looking poor, so the fabric fortresses remained. Meanwhile, poorer households had the opposite problem. With fewer resources for decoration, their bedrooms were bare and drafty, but they also avoided some of the suffocating buildup of soot and germs. In an odd twist, a family with fewer furnishings might have been healthier if colder than their wealthier neighbours drowning in fabric. By the late 19th century, as germ theory gained ground, some reformers began to advocate for simpler, cleaner bedrooms. Advice manuals urged people to wash curtains regularly, though no one really wanted to wrestle a soot-filled drape into a washtub. Lighter, more breathable designs began to appear in wealthier homes, but for much of the Victorian era, the bedroom was an accidental health hazard, lovingly constructed one tassel at a time. So the next time you think your room feels a bit stuffy, spare a thought for the Victorians. They perfected the art of sleeping in a sealed chamber of dust, germs and arsenic wallpaper, all in the name of comfort and class. It turns out their bedrooms weren't sanctuaries of sleep. They were slow-motion death traps disguised in velvet. Today, we think of sleep hygiene as avoiding screens before bed, sipping chamomile tea, and pretending we'll only scroll TikTok for 5 minutes. But in the Victorian era, sleep hygiene meant something far more dramatic, dragging your entire bedding set into the street, opening every window until your face turned blue, and declaring war on the invisible enemy known as bad air. Victorians loved rules. They had etiquette books for conversation, guidebooks for dining, and yes, entire manuals about how to sleep properly. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was a moral duty. To wake refreshed was to prove you were a disciplined, civilized human being, unlike those scandalous people who snored until noon. And so they developed elaborate sleep hygiene rituals that, ironically, often left them more uncomfortable than rested. Imagine it's a foggy morning in London. The streets are already thick with coal smoke, horse manure, and the vague smell of overcooked cabbage. And what do? Why, you drag your bedsheets outside and flap them in the air, of course. Victorians were convinced that beds collected miasmas during the night, invisible poisonous vapors thought to cause disease. This wasn't a fringe belief, it was mainstream science at the time. Doctors warned that a poorly aired bed was basically a death trap, slowly suffocating you with your own recycled exhalations. So every morning, the devoted housewife or maid would take sheets, blankets, and sometimes even mattresses, and give them a good beating outside. This practice was called airing, though in smoky London the term could just as well have been fumigating with soot. Fresh air, the Victorians believed, had magical purifying properties. Too bad their definition of fresh often included coal dust and horse traffic. Part of Victorian sleep hygiene meant keeping windows cracked or flung wide open at night, no matter the season. Ventilation was the buzzword of the century. Pamphlets and medical journals insisted that a closed window invited disease. Germ theory wasn't fully accepted yet, but drafts? Drafts were considered life-saving, and so many Victorians bundled up in layers of woolen blankets while icy winter air streamed through the bedroom. Some doctors even encouraged sleeping with your head close to the window for maximum air renewal. Never mind that you woke up shivering and possibly with frostbite, at least you weren't breathing stale air. Of course, open windows in industrial cities didn't mean crisp alpine breezes. It usually meant waking to find a thin film of soot decorating your pillowcase. Congratulations, you're now asleep and freezing, but at least the cholera got some circulation. Daytime airing also extended to the sun's rays. Many Victorians believed sunlight had purifying effects. Bedrooms were supposed to be flooded with light during the day to kill lingering vapors. Curtains would be pulled back, windows thrown open, and bedding spread wide for the sun to bake out the badness. But here's the catch. Too much sunlight was also feared for weakening fabrics, and more importantly, ruining one's pale complexion. The result? A bizarre contradiction in which bedrooms had to be both sunlit for hygiene and darkened with heavy curtains for modesty and fashion. Sleep hygiene and interior design were locked in a perpetual tug-of-war, and often the loser was the person actually trying to sleep. Victorian guides didn't stop at the sheets. Entire pre-sleep routines were recommended to ensure purity. One was the nightly sponge bath, ideally with cold water. This was supposed to invigorate the body and prevent night sweats. Of course, plunging yourself into icy water right before bed doesn't exactly set the stage for relaxation. Instead of drifting into a peaceful slumber, you'd spend the first half hour trying to stop your teeth from chattering. Other advice included brushing hair thoroughly to stimulate the scalp, scrubbing teeth, and even lightly slapping the skin to rouse the circulation. Victorians basically turned bedtime into a boot camp, all in the name of sleeping more naturally. Victorian sleep hygiene was also obsessed with smells. The fear of foul air meant that bedrooms had to be scrubbed, polished, and occasionally fumigated. Bowls of vinegar were sometimes placed around the room to cleanse the atmosphere. Camphor, lavender sachets, and even burning sulfur were used to disinfect sleeping quarters. These efforts didn't just target disease, they also targeted body odor. After all, indoor plumbing was still inconsistent, and soap wasn't always used liberally. Sleep hygiene often doubled as olfactory camouflage, a way to reassure yourself that your bedroom was fit for unconsciousness, even if the lingering smell of coal smoke told a different story. Much like everything else in Victorian life, sleep hygiene became a marker of class. Manuals scolded the poor for their unwholesome habits. Too many people sharing one bed, windows nailed shut against the cold, or sheets left unwashed. The middle classes prided themselves on following the latest hygienic fashions, even if it meant more chores and more discomfort. Airing sheets was a visible act of morality, a way to demonstrate that you weren't just clean, you were respectably clean. So what was the end result of all these sleep hygiene rituals? Ironically, a lot of lost sleep. Dragging sheets outside daily was exhausting. Sleeping with the window open in January was freezing. Vinegar bowls made the room smell like a salad bar, and the anxiety over whether you were doing it right probably kept many Victorians wide awake. They wanted to sleep better, but like so many Victorian pursuits, the result was often more complicated than restful. In trying to outsmart the mysteries of sleep, they ended up making it one more thing to stress over. If you couldn't sleep in Victorian Britain, the good news was that you had options. The bad news, most of them could kill you, or at the very least make you mildly addicted to narcotics before breakfast. The Victorians, ever the experimenters in domestic science, treated their bodies like pharmacies with legs. Sleep wasn't just something you either had or didn't. It was something you could purchase in a little bottle, preferably from a respectable-looking apothecary with an extravagant moustache, and no concern for modern safety regulations. The reigning monarch of Victorian sleep aids was laudanum, which was basically opium mixed with alcohol and politely disguised in a respectable brown glass bottle. It was marketed as a cure-all: headaches, hysteria, toothaches, teething babies, and of course insomnia. You couldn't drift off to dreamland. 2 spoonfuls of this, and you'd be lucky if you woke up before the next solar eclipse. Mothers dosed their children with it. Doctors prescribed it liberally, and writers sang its praises between bouts of addiction-fueled despair. Thomas de Quincey even wrote an entire book about his love affair with opium, proving that if Victorians couldn't sleep, they'd at least write dramatically about the experience. If laudanum was too strong, or you didn't like your dreams haunted by visions of elephants wearing waistcoats, you could always try chloral hydrate, charmingly known as a Mickey Finn in some circles. Chloral hydrate was marketed as a soothing sleeping potion, but its main effect was to knock you out faster than a heavyweight boxer. It was mixed into everything from tonics to cordials, meaning your glass of herbal sleep water might actually be chemical warfare against your nervous system. But in the Victorian mind, if you awoke groggy, confused, and vaguely poisoned, that was just the price of a good night's rest. And then there was alcohol. The nightcap wasn't only a literal cap you wore to bed to avoid drafts. It was also a generous pour of sherry, brandy, or hot toddy before you crawled under your mountain of germ-trapping blankets. Doctors didn't see this as dangerous. Quite the opposite, in fact. Alcohol was praised as a natural sleep inducer, conveniently ignoring the fact that it disrupts sleep cycles and leaves you staggering around like a half-awake zombie the next morning. But for the Victorians, who considered sobriety suspiciously puritanical, a splash of brandy was just another part of the bedtime ritual. For the children, because yes, Victorians didn't see why kids should be left out of the fun, there were soothing syrups, specifically marketed to mothers who couldn't deal with teething screams or nighttime tantrums. These syrups often contained opium, morphine, chloroform, or sometimes all three, plus a dash of alcohol for good measure. Imagine rocking your crying baby to sleep, giving them a teaspoon of soothing syrup, and then realizing you'd basically given your child a cocktail fit for a back alley surgeon. Unsurprisingly, infant mortality rates were not helped by this innovation, but the advertisements promised peaceful slumber, and peace and quiet were sometimes more persuasive than science. Not all remedies involved narcotics, of course. For those reluctant to jump straight into chemical dependency, there were gentler herbal remedies. Lavender sachets tucked into pillows, valerian root teas, and chamomile infusions were all part of the Victorian toolkit. Unfortunately, the potency of these concoctions varied wildly, depending on whether your herbs had been grown in a sunny country estate or scraped from a soot-choked alley in London. Some people swore by warm milk as a bedtime aid, which compared to laudanum was practically wholesome. But if you wanted quick results, a lavender pillow wasn't going to compete with a dose of pure opium. The Victorians were also enthusiastic about patent medicines, over-the-counter tonics with mysterious labels and even more mysterious ingredients. Bottles with names like Dr. James's Restorative Night Elixir or Professor Holloway's Sleep Balm promised deep restorative rest without ever listing what they actually contained. Spoiler alert, most contained alcohol, opiates, or some other active ingredient that modern pharmacology would strongly recommend avoiding. Yet customers bought them by the crate, convinced that the scientific-sounding names made them safer than a whiskey-soaked poppy infusion. It's easy to laugh at these concoctions now, but the Victorian obsession with chemical sleep aids reflected a genuine problem. Industrial society simply wasn't restful. The constant noise of urban life, the long working hours, and the general anxiety of living in an era of relentless change meant that sleeplessness was practically a national condition. So instead of addressing the root causes like factory schedules, gaslight-induced insomnia, or the sheer stress of keeping up with etiquette, they reached for the nearest bottle of narcotic syrup. The irony is that many Victorians actually understood that their sleep tonics weren't healthy in the long run. Doctors occasionally warned against overuse, but without a clear sense of dosage or regulation, that advice was as effective as telling someone not to overeat at a Victorian banquet. Addiction was common, especially among women, who were more likely to be prescribed laudanum for nerves or melancholia. Entire households quietly relied on chemical crutches to get through the night, creating a society where everyone was a little bit sedated but no one dared admit it. So while today we might down a melatonin gummy and complain if it doesn't kick in within half an hour, the Victorians were experimenting with far more potent bedtime cocktails. Sleep, for them, was a battle between exhaustion and chemistry, and often the chemistry won, at least until the side effects caught up. In the end, their quest for sweet slumber proved that the Victorians never did anything halfway. If they wanted rest, they were willing to drug themselves into oblivion to get it. For the Victorians, bedtime was rarely silent. If you imagine drifting off to sleep under the gentle glow of candlelight and the soft rustling of curtains, think again. Industrial London wasn't exactly a lullaby. Instead, nights were filled with an orchestra of clamour that could rival a modern rock concert, except less fun and with a lot more horse manure involved. The age of gas lamps illuminated the city beautifully, but they came with a price: noise. Gas lamps needed attendants, men who walked the streets with ladders and long poles to light or extinguish them. That meant clanging, banging, and muttered swearing beneath your window just as you were tucking in. And once the lamps were lit, the streets didn't fall quiet, they came alive. Light invited activity, and activity meant noise. Night was no longer the still, dark void it had been for centuries. It was a Victorian version of 24/7 city life, only powered by hooves and lungs instead of neon signs and car horns. The real racket, though, came from transportation. London streets teemed with carriages, carts, and wagons, all of them pulled by horses, whose hooves hammered against cobblestones like relentless war drums. Each clop echoed and multiplied through the narrow streets, bouncing between brick buildings until it sounded like an army was galloping past your bedroom. Add in the drivers, who yelled at their horses, at pedestrians, or sometimes just at life itself, and you had a soundtrack of chaos. Factories didn't help. While some shut down after dark, others ran through the night, puffing smoke and pounding machinery. The steady thud of textile mills, or the hiss of steam engines carried for blocks, and where there was industry, there were workers, trudging home with heavy boots, singing bawdy songs, or stopping for a brawl outside the local tavern. Nothing like trying to dream sweet dreams while two dock workers shouted insults that could peel the paint off your shutters. Let's not forget the local wildlife which thrived in the city's refuse. Cats screeched territorial arias in alleyways, and rats scurried noisily in the walls. Dogs barked, sometimes all night, sometimes seemingly just for sport. One Victorian diarist noted that he could tell which neighbour had gone drinking based on whose dogs started howling at midnight. And if all of that wasn't enough, you might also get the occasional drunk opera singer, or at least someone convinced he was one, serenading the neighbourhood from the gutter. Imagine trying to drift into dreamland with "O Sol Mio" being belted 3 doors down in the key of unholy. So how did Victorians cope? Earplugs weren't yet a common commodity, so people improvised. Some stuffed cotton balls into their ears, though these fell out easily and offered minimal protection against industrial thunder. Wax was another option, molded into rough plugs, though comfort was questionable. Others relied on the simplest method, pillows. Not the kind of noise-cancelling technology we know today, but a desperate burying of one's head under as many feathers as could be piled up. Of course, that came with the added risk of suffocating before you could actually fall asleep. But the Victorians were no strangers to taking risks in the pursuit of comfort. The wealthier classes had the luxury of retreating further from the chaos. Mansions on the outskirts of the city provided quieter sleep, with only the occasional sound of a servant creeping down a corridor. But even in the countryside, peace was not guaranteed. Nocturnal farm life brought its own disturbances. Owls hooting, cows lowing, roosters mistaking midnight for dawn. Still, it was preferable to the din of London, where the air itself seemed to vibrate with clamour. This all paints a picture of a society perpetually deprived of silence, and yet the Victorians adapted. They did what humans always do, complained loudly in diaries, made jokes in newspapers, and developed a kind of resilience. After all, if you can learn to sleep through hooves, factory whistles, and your neighbour's bar fight, then perhaps insomnia becomes less of a problem. The irony is that many Victorians still complained of sleeplessness, but when one considers the symphony of the night, it's a wonder they managed any rest at all. Imagine for a moment lying there, tucked under layers of quilts, trying desperately to count sheep. Just as you reach sheep number 17, a carriage wheel splashes through a puddle outside your window, spraying muddy water against your wall. You adjust, try again. Sheep number 32 is interrupted by 2 men shouting about who owes whom a pint. By sheep 45, the opera singer has started up again, and the dog across the street has decided he'd like to provide harmony. Sleep, at that point, isn't so much a biological necessity as it is a stubborn act of defiance. The Victorians persevered in this nightly battle, but it was far from peaceful. Their nights were noisy, restless, and chaotic, a reflection of the industrial machine grinding forward even while the city slept, or at least tried to. And so the soundscape of Victorian nights wasn't a gentle lullaby, but rather the booming anthem of progress, punctuated by hoofbeats, shouting, and just a touch of feline caterwauling. If the Victorians were good at anything, it was turning everyday life into a source of anxiety, and sleep was no exception. Nightmares weren't just bad dreams, they were omens, warnings, and sometimes even divine messages in the night. Waking up sweaty at 3 a.m. after dreaming about a giant angry goose wasn't just dismissed as strange. No, it was analysed, moralised, and most importantly worried over, until everyone felt sufficiently haunted. In a society that loved both religious symbolism and medical speculation, dreams became a curious battleground between science, superstition, and a deep-rooted fear that the cheese plate at dinner was plotting against you. For starters, the Victorians were big believers in dreams as portents. Entire books were published that acted as dream dictionaries, explaining what it meant if you saw a dog, faithfulness, a coffin, death, naturally, or if you were flying, your morals were probably slipping. People devoured these guides with the same enthusiasm that modern readers have for horoscopes. Woke up dreaming about teeth falling out? Congratulations, your finances are doomed. Found yourself chased by shadowy figures? Time to repent. Or at least consider laying off the late-night brandy. This seriousness about nightmares was deeply tied to the era's religious undercurrents. Evangelical preachers often warned congregations that sinful thoughts could literally manifest in their dreams as punishments from God. A lustful dream wasn't just embarrassing, it was practically a fire and brimstone sermon delivered in REM sleep. Imagine the stress of knowing even your subconscious could incriminate you. Not only were you judged for your actions during the day, but your night terrors were also held up as evidence of moral decay. And then, of course, there was cheese. Victorians were firmly convinced that certain foods had a direct impact on dreams, and cheese bore the brunt of the blame. Hard cheese in particular was seen as a surefire ticket to a restless night full of strange visions. Why cheese? Partly because the digestion theories of the time claimed that heavy or fermenting foods created unsettling vapors in the body. Those vapors would supposedly rise to the brain and disturb your sleep, turning a wedge of Stilton into the midnight equivalent of Freddy Krueger. Advice manuals sternly warned against the indulgence of cheese after supper, if one valued peaceful slumber. For a nation obsessed with tea, pies, and puddings, this dietary policing was not well received, but many obeyed out of sheer fear of spectral consequences. Children, too, weren't spared from nightmare management. Bedtime stories often carried heavy-handed warnings about bad dreams as punishments for disobedience. If little Tommy snuck sweets or fibbed about chores, he might be threatened with a night stalked by goblins or witches. This gave Victorian kids a unique bedtime routine. Say prayers, tuck in, and prepare to be terrified by the very people tucking you in. While modern parents might avoid scaring children before bed, Victorian adults seemed to view it as a moral duty. Sweet dreams weren't guaranteed, but character-building nightmares, absolutely. Scientific voices tried to weigh in, of course. Doctors like Robert Macnish, who wrote The Philosophy of Sleep in 1830, argued that nightmares were more about physiology than morality. According to him and other medical men of the age, nightmares stemmed from indigestion, bad posture, or insufficient circulation. That meant doctors often gave practical advice that sounded suspiciously like Victorian common sense. Don't go to bed overstuffed, don't drink too much, and for heaven's sake, don't lie face down with your stomach squashed. Of course, many Victorians happily ignored these recommendations, opting instead to see their dreams as personalized cosmic telegrams. The cultural fascination with nightmares also seeped into literature. Gothic novels thrived on the idea that bad dreams blurred the line between reality and the supernatural. Characters tormented by visions of ghosts or devils at night often woke up to find those fears weren't dreams at all. Authors like Sheridan Le Fanu and Wilkie Collins leaned into this, making nightmares almost an expected part of the Victorian horror toolkit. Reading such stories before bed probably didn't help anyone's sleep hygiene, but it did reinforce the idea that the night held sinister possibilities. For the ordinary sleeper, this meant bedtime was rarely just about pulling up the covers. It was about managing the invisible risks of the dream world, from spiritual warnings to dietary mistakes. Advice manuals suggested light suppers, calming prayers, and even carefully chosen bedtime readings to encourage wholesome dreaming. Dreaming of angels was a sign you were on the right track, while dreaming of skeletons meant, well, perhaps it was time to rethink your cheese intake. So when the Victorian lay down at night, they weren't simply drifting off to sleep. They were stepping into a world that felt like a moral testing ground, where every nightmare was a message and every midnight fright a possible omen. Add in a society already anxious about sin, death, and industrial change, and you've got a recipe for restless nights. The modern reader may laugh at the idea of blaming cheddar for bad dreams, but when your nightly cheese plate could also be your spiritual undoing, sleep became more than just rest. It became a matter of survival, or at least a matter of not waking up convinced you were doomed. The Victorians loved two things above all else: rules and gadgets. If they weren't inventing a complicated etiquette ritual for eating soup, they were hammering together a contraption that promised to solve problems you didn't know you had. Sleep, of course, was one of those problems, and so the 19th century birthed an entire parade of sleep-enhancing devices that ranged from curious to laughably dangerous. Think of it as the precursor to today's smart mattresses, except instead of Bluetooth connectivity, you got cranks, springs, bran, and sometimes a mild electric shock. Sweet dreams. Let's start with the most Victorian-sounding idea of all, the mechanical bed rocker. The principle was simple. If rocking lulled babies to sleep, why not try the same on adults? These contraptions were essentially oversized cradles that could rock an entire grown human back and forth until unconsciousness struck. The problem was that an adult weighing 12 stone doesn't exactly sway as gently as an infant. Imagine drifting off only to be suddenly jolted awake when your entire bed lurches like a carnival ride gone wrong. Neighbors probably assumed an exorcism was taking place. Still, ads promised that you'd wake refreshed, although refreshed might have been a polite euphemism for slightly concussed. Then there were weighted blankets, but not the cozy therapeutic kind you can order online today. Victorians filled theirs with bran. Yes, the same bran you'd normally sprinkle into your breakfast porridge. The theory was that the extra weight would help calm the nervous system, pressing a restless sleeper into submission. Unfortunately, bran has one small problem: it's food, which meant the blanket doubled as an all-you-can-eat buffet for mice and moths. You might have gone to bed hoping for tranquility, but instead awoke to a rodent rave happening under the covers. It's comforting to know that while we worry about dust mites in modern duvets, Victorians had to contend with actual livestock moving in, and then came the early alarm clocks. These weren't the polite digital beeps you snooze through today. No, some alarm clocks used literal bells large enough to wake the entire street, while others incorporated hammers that struck the metal frame of your bed until you practically bounced onto the floor. Some inventive models went even further, tipping the mattress itself so that sleepers rolled onto the floor at the appointed hour. Subtlety, clearly, was not in fashion. Victorians didn't want to gently rouse themselves from slumber. They wanted to be catapulted into consciousness with the enthusiasm of a circus act. But nothing says Victorian sleep aid quite like electricity. In an age when electrocution was still considered a fun party trick, some inventors marketed devices that delivered small shocks to reset your nerves and banish insomnia. The logic went something like this: if your nervous system is misfiring, why not zap it until it behaves? Advertisements promised renewed energy, restful nights, and even cures for hysteria, which was basically Victorian code for "we don't know what's wrong with you, but let's try zapping it anyway." Of course, no one mentioned that strapping wires to your temples before bed could result in the opposite of relaxation. It's hard to feel restful when you're twitching like a frog in a science lab. Nothing says restful slumber like electrocuting yourself before bed. Other gadgets ranged from the simply odd to the spectacularly misguided. There were masks designed to funnel pure air to the sleeper's nose. Never mind that the pure air was usually London smog. Some inventors created elaborate sound machines, not the soothing ocean waves we know today, but mechanical contraptions that imitated rain or rustling leaves, though more often than not they ended up sounding like someone rattling tin pans in the next room. And then there were head harnesses meant to keep your mouth shut while you slept, since snoring was considered both unhealthy and socially embarrassing. A harness might reduce the noise, but it also risked strangling you in your own bed. What's fascinating is how seriously these inventions were marketed. Patent offices were flooded with designs promising scientific slumber. Doctors, eager to show off their modernity, sometimes endorsed them, while newspapers ran glowing testimonials from people who claimed their entire lives had been transformed by a bran blanket or a bed that shook like a stagecoach. The Victorian belief in progress, that anything mechanical or medical must be better than the old way, fueled this inventiveness, even when the results were absurd. Looking back, it's tempting to laugh at these gadgets. But then again, Are we really so different today? We strap fitness trackers to our wrists that monitor REM cycles. We buy pillows infused with copper or lavender, and we spend hundreds on mattresses that promise space-age foam support. In a way, the Victorians weren't just eccentric. They were early adopters of a mindset we still carry, that sleep, a natural biological function, must be hacked, optimized and controlled. Of course, the difference is that our modern inventions don't typically involve rodents nesting in our bedding or electrocution before lights out. But give it time. If history proves anything, it's that humans will go to ridiculous lengths just to get a decent night's sleep. The Victorian era was nothing if not ambitious. These were people who built railroads across continents, telegraphed messages across oceans, and managed to convince an entire empire that boiled cabbage counted as cuisine. Naturally, they also believed they could perfect the act of sleeping, something humanity had managed without too much fuss since cavemen discovered that lying down was easier than standing up. Yet, with the Victorians, the harder they tried to engineer the perfect night's rest, the more they managed to sabotage it. Take the air, for example. No amount of heavy drapery, open windows, or lavender sachets could mask the fact that the industrial city air was closer to a chemical soup than a breeze. London in particular was thick with coal smoke, chimney soot, and the delicate perfume of horse manure. Opening a window for fresh air, as recommended by health manuals, was about as refreshing as taking a nap inside a train's smokestack. Bedrooms filled with velvet curtains and plush carpets were supposed to block drafts, but they also trapped the smog, dust, and disease. You might have thought your chamber resembled a palace, but in reality, you were sleeping in what amounted to a decorative petri dish. And then there were the tonics. If you couldn't drift off naturally, there was always a bottle waiting on the bedside table. Laudanum, a cocktail of opium and alcohol, was practically its own bedtime story. Newspapers and advertisements promoted these elixirs as the cure to everything from restless legs to female troubles. And sure, they did help you fall asleep. The catch was that you might wake up needing just a little more of that sweet sleep syrup every night until, congratulations, you had an opium dependency to rival a Dickensian anti-hero. Sleep came easy, but so did addiction, blurred memories, and the nagging suspicion that your doctor cared less about your well-being and more about selling you another bottle. Meanwhile, the noise of Victorian cities guaranteed that even if you managed to fall asleep, you weren't staying asleep. Gas lamps hissed, factories roared, horses clattered, dogs barked, and the occasional brawl spilled into the street. In a society where houses were crammed shoulder to shoulder, privacy was rare, silence rarer. Some people resorted to stuffing wax in their ears. Others simply tried to pretend the chaos was soothing. It was not. If anything, the constant racket meant that insomnia wasn't just a personal inconvenience. It was practically a civic pastime. The nightmares didn't help either. The Victorians had a talent for making bedtime scarier than necessary. Many believed dreams carried prophetic weight, so a bad one could haunt you long after waking. A slice of cheese before bed, they warned, was practically a one-way ticket to a demonic visitation. Superstitions about ghostly visitations, sleep paralysis demons, and the spiritual significance of dreams meant that closing your eyes carried a hint of danger. Modern nightmares about work emails look tame compared to the Victorian terror of waking up convinced that your soul had been warned about eternal damnation by a bit of cheddar. And in case all of this wasn't enough, the Victorians also invented gadgets to help: weighted blankets stuffed with bran, rocking beds that jolted you awake if you snored too loudly, or electric devices that promised to reset your brain with a jolt of current. It was as though they collectively agreed that nothing said restful like vibrating furniture or mild electrocution. Instead of soothing people to sleep, these devices mostly added a sense of anxiety. Was the machine helping, or was it about to tip you onto the floor? Put it all together and you can see why Victorian sleep was less gentle rest and more overnight endurance test. Bad air, loud streets, fear of nightmares, addictive tonics, and a bedroom that doubled as a velvet-lined disease incubator created the perfect storm. They wanted 8 hours of restorative slumber, but what they got was a generation of people stumbling through the day, propped up by tea, coffee, and the occasional spoonful of narcotics. By comparison, modern sleep looks downright luxurious. Sure, we still wrestle with glowing screens, noisy neighbors, and the occasional bad mattress. But at least we've swapped coal dust for memory foam, laudanum for melatonin gummies, and the sound of drunken opera singers for the white noise of a smartphone app. If the Victorians were here to see it, they'd probably marvel at blackout curtains that actually keep light out instead of trapping smog in. In the end, the Victorian dream of better sleep backfired spectacularly. They tried to control every element: air, fabric, sound, medicine, even the mechanics of the bed itself, and managed only to make things worse. As one might put it, the Victorians didn't just invent insomnia, they gave it style, curtains, and a faint whiff of laudanum. The humor, of course, is that they were so close to figuring it out. All they really needed was a decent mattress, a quiet room, and the absence of coal smoke. Instead, they turned sleep into yet another arena of overthinking and industrial meddling. The result? Nights of tossing and turning under heavy curtains, with dreams disturbed by both cheese and the sound of passing carts. The Victorians wanted better sleep, but instead they invented insomnia with extra steps. If you were a construction worker in ancient Egypt, your paycheck wasn't coins, it wasn't gold, and it definitely wasn't health insurance. No, you were compensated in something far more motivating: beer. Forget direct deposit. In Egypt, it was direct pint. Beer wasn't just a nice after-work drink. It was the cornerstone of Egyptian society. The pyramids, those giant piles of stone that make modern architects cry into their blueprints, weren't built on sweat and determination alone. They were built on a steady flow of liquid carbs. Workers received daily rations of bread and beer, not only because the state needed to keep thousands of men fueled for back-breaking labor, but also because beer was basically liquid bread. It had calories, vitamins, and just enough alcohol to dull the pain of hauling 2-ton blocks under the desert sun. And before you imagine these guys sipping on golden pints with frothy heads like in a commercial, let's set the record straight. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and about as far from your crisp lager as possible. Think of it less like something you'd order at a bar, and more like a liquid loaf of bread someone left in the rain. But the workers weren't picky. After all, when your alternative was Nile River water swimming with bacteria and the occasional dead fish, beer suddenly looked like the healthier option. Yes, beer was safer than water. Imagine explaining that to your doctor today. I don't drink water because it makes me sick. I only drink beer for health reasons. But in Egypt it made sense. Brewing killed harmful bacteria, and the alcohol content, modest but enough, kept the nasties away. So while we drink water to hydrate, Egyptians drank beer to survive. Beer's importance didn't stop at construction sites. It was everywhere. In fact, beer was considered such an essential part of life that it was woven into religion. The goddess Hathor, associated with joy, dance, and music, was also celebrated with beer festivals. There's even a myth where Hathor went on a rampage to punish humanity, but was tricked into drinking vats of beer dyed red to look like blood. She got so drunk she passed out and forgot to destroy the world. So yes, according to Egyptian mythology, beer literally saved humanity. Somewhere out there a brewer deserves eternal credit. Even funerals had beer. Tomb offerings regularly included jars of it, because nobody wanted to spend eternity in the afterlife without a drink. Archaeologists digging up tombs have found not just beer jars, but actual brewery remains, because if you're going to have eternal rest, you might as well have eternal happy hour. And it wasn't just the poor workers slugging down this sludgy brew. Permus drank it, priests drank it, women drank it, and even kids had their own watered-down version called small beer. Yes, Egyptian childhood came with a pint-sized pint. Forget juice boxes. Children in Egypt had beer mugs. Imagine a school lunchbox filled with a sandwich, an apple, and a tiny clay jug of beer. Truly, history's strangest kids menu. Now, how did they make this ancient miracle drink? The recipe was surprisingly straightforward. Start with bread, usually baked only halfway, then crumble it into water, let it sit, ferment, and voila, bread soup that got you tipsy. They added dates or honey to make it sweeter, though given the smell of ancient streets, sweet is a relative term. Brewing was mostly done at a household level, with women taking the lead. In fact, many of the earliest brewers were women, which makes sense. If you're already baking bread, why not double the recipe and make beer too? Efficiency at its finest. But beer wasn't just food and drink, it was currency. Workers could be paid in beer the way we get paid in cash. Records from pyramid-building projects show laborers received up to 4 liters of beer a day. 4 liters. That's not a bonus, that's a lifestyle. Imagine modern payroll. Congratulations, you've completed your 40 hours this week. Here are your 28 liters of Bud Light. Suddenly, Mondays wouldn't seem so bad. Beer also served as social glue. Taverns and beer houses popped up in towns, where people could drink, gossip, and occasionally brawl. Taxes were collected in beer too. The government understood one universal truth: if you want compliance, tie it to alcohol. Pharaohs didn't just rule with armies and monuments, they ruled with barley, and if you think this was a uniquely Egyptian thing, it wasn't. But Egypt took beer culture to an art form. They immortalized it in art, hieroglyphics and rituals. They even had specialized gods and prayers for brewing. Where today people say grace before a meal, Egyptians might have raised a jug and thanked the gods for fermentation. The takeaway? Civilization wasn't built on lofty ideals alone. It was built on carbs, yeast, and a mild buzz. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was wages, medicine, social life, religion, and survival, all rolled into one foamy, sludgy cup. So the next time you see the Great Pyramid of Giza, don't just think of pharaohs and tombs. Think of thousands of sunburned workers, sweaty and sore, hauling stone blocks while looking forward to their daily pint. Forget built by slaves. Those pyramids were built by beer. If ancient Egypt ran on beer, then Greece and Rome ran on wine, oceans of the stuff. To these Mediterranean cultures, wine wasn't just a beverage, it was philosophy fuel, political currency, and the ancient equivalent of a social networking app. Today we debate over lattes or craft cocktails. Back then, Plato and Aristotle debated over goblets of red, probably slurring their way through the birth of Western thought. In ancient Greece, drinking wasn't just casual fun, it was structured. Enter the symposium, a word that technically means drinking together, but in practice was a mashup of TED Talk, toga party, and group therapy. A symposium would start with a meal, but the real show began when the wine came out. Men lounged on couches, slaves refilled cups, musicians played, poets recited, and everyone tried to look intellectual, while getting progressively less so. But don't imagine this as free-flowing chugging contests. The Greeks were serious about their wine etiquette. They watered it down, usually 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric, something only uncivilized foreigners did. In other words, if you drank undiluted wine in Greece, people looked at you the way we look at someone who eats raw ramen noodles. Yes, it's possible. No, it doesn't make you sophisticated. Of course, that didn't mean symposiums stayed dignified for long. Discussions about virtue and politics could quickly dissolve into drunk karaoke, philosophical rambling, or deciding that the neighbor's goat was looking at you funny. Some symposiums even included drinking games like Kottabos, where you tried to flick the dregs of your wine onto a target. Think beer pong, but with clay goblets, sticky wine stains, and philosophers cheering you on. The funny thing is that some of humanity's greatest ideas may have been born in this haze of diluted alcohol. Socrates, for instance, was notorious for being able to outdrink everyone else while remaining perfectly coherent. Imagine your friend who can down 5 glasses of wine at a party and still lecture you about economics. That was Socrates. Plato may have invented Western philosophy, but half of it was probably just wine-fueled shower thoughts. The Romans, being Romans, saw what the Greeks were doing and said, "Cool idea, but let's go bigger." Wine in Rome wasn't limited to elite gatherings. It was everywhere for everyone. By the 1st century CE, wine was being imported, exported, taxed, traded, and produced on an industrial scale. The Romans drank so much of it that entire hillsides were stripped bare to make vineyards. But Roman wine wasn't just wine, it came in a dizzying variety of flavors and enhancements. Honey, herbs, spices, tree resins. If it could dissolve, it probably ended up in a Roman jug. One particularly questionable recipe included mixing wine with seawater. Yes, seawater. Imagine ordering a Merlot and getting a salty gulp that tastes like the Mediterranean slapped you in the face. And the Romans thought this was sophisticated. Wine was also a sharp marker of class. The wealthy enjoyed vintage wines aged in amphorae, flavored with saffron or rose petals. Meanwhile, the poor drank sour, cheap versions barely fit for vinegar. Slaves, they got their wine watered down to near homeopathic levels. Basically, if you wanted to know someone's place in society, you didn't look at their clothes, you looked at what they had in their cup. And yet, despite the class divide, everyone in Rome drank wine. Soldiers carried it on campaigns, peasants guzzled it after farm work, politicians toasted endless deals with it, and emperors drowned in it, sometimes literally. The emperor Elagabalus was said to serve wine mixed with gold flakes, a drink that says, "This might kill you, but at least you'll die fabulously." Both cultures, of course, tied wine to the divine. The Greeks had Dionysus, god of wine, theatre, and things that got out of hand after midnight. Festivals in his honor were wild, ecstatic events involving music, dancing, and more than a few questionable decisions. These parties weren't just drunken raves, they were considered spiritual. To get tipsy was to touch the divine. The Romans adopted Dionysus but renamed him Bacchus, and took the festivals to a whole new level. The Bacchanalia became so notorious for wild behavior that the Roman Senate eventually tried to ban them. Imagine politicians passing a law because too many toga parties were breaking out across the empire. That was Rome. For Greece and Rome, wine wasn't a luxury, it was identity. It separated them from barbarians, it fueled their philosophies, it greased the wheels of politics, and it brought people together, whether for debate, theatre, or chaos. And let's be clear, this wasn't the refined wine culture we imagine today, with sommeliers sniffing corks and talking about notes of blackberry. This was a world where mixing seawater in your Merlot was considered chic, where flicking dregs across a room was a party trick, and where a god of wine had more holidays than some emperors. So the next time you sip a glass of red, picture the ancient Mediterranean, Greek philosophers arguing over diluted wine, while Roman senators guzzled salted vintages in golden cups. Civilizations rose and fell, armies marched, and empires crumbled. But through it all, the wine kept flowing. Because if Egypt showed us that beer could build pyramids, Greece and Rome proved that wine could build philosophy, politics, and the occasional very bad decision. Picture Europe in the Middle Ages, castles towering over villages, peasants laboring in muddy fields, and a general consensus that drinking water was a lethal gamble. Seriously. Rivers, wells, and streams were often contaminated with sewage, animal runoff, and whatever medieval humans thought was acceptable disposal. Drinking it? A fast track to dysentery, plague, or a stomach so upset it could stage its own rebellion. The solution? Ale. Ale wasn't just a safer alternative, it was practically a staple food. It provided calories, nutrition, and hydration all in one frothy package. Unlike the beer of ancient Egypt or the wine of Greece and Rome, medieval ale came in various strengths. There was small beer, a weak version suitable for children, servants, and anyone who needed to stay functional without stumbling into a cart or tripping over a cow, and yes, children drank it. Today we worry about kids having soda or sugar cereal. Back then it was a clay mug of slightly alcoholic liquid. Imagine a kindergartner clumsily balancing a 1% ABV ale on a stool while singing Twinkle Twinkle. Medieval parenting was different. The stronger ale was the province of adults, and its potency could vary widely from village to village. It was both a comfort and a social lubricant. It could make a long day of ploughing fields feel shorter, a cold winter evening warmer, and a tedious sermon slightly more tolerable. In a world where heating was rudimentary at best, and bread often tasted like compressed sawdust, ale had the magical ability to make everything more bearable. Monasteries were not just centers of prayer and copying manuscripts. They were the medieval equivalent of craft breweries. Monks had the time, resources, and obsessive attention to detail needed to perfect brewing. By keeping detailed records, experimenting with ingredients, and learning how to control fermentation, they elevated ale-making from crude village concoction to something approaching art. Some monasteries even brewed specialty ales for special occasions, much like vintners making a reserve wine today. And the monks weren't doing it purely for profit, though some monasteries made serious money from selling ale. Brewing was also seen as a form of hospitality and charity. Pilgrims, travelers, and the occasional hungry peasant could always find a mug of warm ale at the monastery gate. One can imagine a weary traveler knocking on the door, greeted not by a grumpy innkeeper but by a smiling monk holding a steaming jug. "Welcome. Here, drink this and try not to die from dysentery." Monks were basically the original combination of brewery, pharmacy, and bed and breakfast. While monasteries brewed, villages and towns had alehouses, the original community centers. These weren't just places to get drunk. They were hubs of gossip, news, negotiation, and networking. Think of them as Facebook, Reddit, and the local town hall rolled into one smoky, rowdy room. Contracts were signed, disputes mediated, romances sparked, and occasionally brawls broke out, all over a mug of frothy ale. Alehouses were democratic in a way modern bars can only dream of. Nobles might have had private halls in castles, but the village alehouse welcomed farmers, blacksmiths, and millers alike. The local news travelled fastest through these establishments. Sir Geoffrey lost a cow to the river, or the baker's daughter ran off with a travelling minstrel. All of this delivered with a side of foam. Ale wasn't just about fun or socializing, it was also about survival. Water was unreliable. Wells could be contaminated. Rainwater could carry disease. Ale, thanks to the fermentation process, was comparatively safe. And it wasn't weak tea either. Even small beer had enough alcohol to kill bacteria, while still being light enough for regular consumption. Drinking ale was a pragmatic choice, a life hack in a pre-scientific world. Humorously, historians note that in some regions ale was considered part of the daily diet. One could consume several liters a day and still function more or less normally. It's hard to imagine a world where adults, teens, and children alike sipped alcoholic beverages from dawn till dusk and still managed to farm, trade, or fight off occasional raiding parties. Yet somehow humanity survived, proving once again that a little alcohol can go a long way. Ale wasn't uniform. Ingredients depended on the local barley, available herbs, and the brewer's creativity. Some villages added spices like juniper, sage, or even heather, making their ale taste more like a botanical experiment than a beverage. Taxes were sometimes collected in ale. Lords and kings recognized that a village's brew output was as valuable as wheat or livestock. Non-payment could mean legal trouble or public humiliation at the alehouse. Festivals were heavily centered around drinking. Midsummer, harvest, or saint days often included communal drinking competitions, music, and dancing. Getting tipsy wasn't frowned upon, it was practically mandatory. So, to sum up, medieval Europeans didn't just survive on ale, they thrived on it. It fed the body, lubricated society, and even acted as an early form of medicine. Alehouses were the information superhighways of their day, and monasteries were the tech startups of brewing. Children drank it for sustenance, adults for pleasure, and everyone appreciated it for keeping them alive in a world where a glass of water could be deadly. As one historian might put it, in the Middle Ages, if you drank water, you got sick. If you drank ale, you got tipsy. Easy choice. Indeed, civilization, it seems, advanced on frothy mugs as much as on swords and ploughs. 18th century London had a problem, and it wasn't just smog, rats, or the occasional horse collapse in the street. It was gin. Cheap, potent, and everywhere, gin became the lifeblood of the city, flowing through alleyways and taverns like an invisible river of trouble. As one contemporary said, you could get drunk for a penny. dead drunk for two, and it seems Londoners were more than happy to take the offer. Gin wasn't just a drink, it was a social phenomenon. What started as a domestic spirit, brewed in small batches, became a city-wide obsession. Poorer neighborhoods were flooded with cheap gin, sometimes diluted, sometimes dangerously pure, and always addictive. It was stronger than beer, cheaper than wine, and easier to acquire than food in some districts. People who couldn't afford a proper meal might buy a small measure of gin to stave off hunger, warming the stomach and numbing the mind at the same time. For the city's poor, gin wasn't a luxury. It was a coping mechanism for life in a rapidly growing, filthy, overcrowded metropolis. The effects of this juniper revolution were catastrophic. Crime spiked as sobriety became increasingly rare, children were neglected while parents slurred through their days, and the streets were littered with the consequences of too many nights spent in a fog of alcohol. Families collapsed under the weight of addiction, and public officials despaired at the sheer audacity of the populace's thirst. It wasn't uncommon for infants to be given a taste of gin to calm them, a fact immortalized in William Hogarth's infamous engraving Gin Lane, where babies were literally depicted in the arms of mothers reaching for the bottle. The image captures a city simultaneously tragic and absurd, showing how a single spirit could wreak havoc on every level of society, from cradle to grave. But why gin, and why London? It had to do with policy, trade, and a dash of economic opportunism. Parliament, hoping to boost domestic spirits production, encouraged the distillation of gin in the late 17th century. Imported French brandy was expensive and heavily taxed, while local gin could be made cheaply and sold to the masses. Distillers took full advantage, producing ever more potent spirits and selling them at prices so low that even the poorest labourer could afford regular doses. The city essentially became one giant tasting room, with corners and basements doubling as micro-distilleries and gin shops. London wasn't just foggy, it was drunk. The city basically ran on juniper fumes. The social impact was staggering. Alehouses and taverns, already crowded and rowdy, became the epicenters of gin culture. Entire neighborhoods became notorious for drunkenness, crime, and public disorder. Street brawls, theft, and public vomiting were daily occurrences, yet somehow life went on. The city's poor, navigating narrow, filthy streets found in gin a kind of perverse stability. If you couldn't change your circumstances, at least you could forget them, even for a few hours. Gin gave the powerless a small measure of escape, though at a heavy cost. The gin craze also influenced literature, art, and morality tales. Hogarth's work, while horrifying to some, served as a warning to society. Uncontrolled alcohol consumption could destroy families and communities, yet it was impossible to resist. Gin was cheap, accessible, and culturally embedded in a city that had long relied on spirits to get through harsh winters, overcrowded housing, and the grinding demands of daily survival. Londoners drank as a necessity, as rebellion, and sometimes simply as a way to pass the time in a city that offered little comfort otherwise. Public authorities attempted intervention, but regulation was never as fast or effective as the gin itself. Taxes and restrictions were introduced, but bootleggers, black market distillers, and entrepreneurial shopkeepers ensured the flow continued. The more the government tried to control gin, the more inventive people became at circumventing rules. Like any good catastrophe, the crisis escalated because human ingenuity, when combined with alcohol, knows no limits. For historians, the gin craze represents more than just drunkenness. It's a snapshot of a society under stress, where economic inequality, poor urban planning, and social pressures collided with a substance that could magnify both relief and despair. It shows that alcohol has always been more than recreation. It can influence cities, economies, and human behavior on a massive scale. And for all its chaos, there was a dark comedy to it. Infants in the streets, drunken mothers collapsing on staircases, and the general public wandering around, clinging to bottles as if they contained the very meaning of life. In the end, the gin craze of London is a reminder that civilization doesn't progress in a straight line. Sometimes it staggers along tipsy and disoriented, and yet somehow survives. The city endured, policies shifted, and eventually moderation returned, though not before the streets had been paved with gin-soaked misery, misfortune and stories worthy of being retold centuries later. London learned a lesson it would never forget. If you give a city cheap alcohol, it will take full advantage. Even in the modern era, alcohol has refused to surrender its role as a civilizational catalyst. Long after beer built pyramids, wine inspired philosophers, ale lubricated medieval society, gin wreaked havoc in London, and prohibition sent America into stylish chaos, humans continued to rely on booze in both the mundane and the extraordinary. By the 20th century, alcohol had become as much a tool of morale as it was of indulgence, and sometimes even a weapon of survival. During World War II, soldiers on every front relied on alcohol not as a vice but as part of military protocol. British troops received rum rations, while American GIs were issued beer when supply lines permitted. The reasoning was simple. A bit of alcohol helped calm nerves, boosted courage before battle, and provided a morale lift when letters from home weren't enough. On the battlefield, a sip of rum could turn a terrified soldier into someone who at least looked brave enough to charge into the chaos of war. The fact that alcohol could be used in strategic planning is both impressive and slightly terrifying. Imagine generals debating tactics while their troops are partially lubricated by spirits. And yet it worked. Troops appreciated it, morale improved, and historians now note that the ration system kept countless soldiers psychologically functional under unimaginable stress. Of course, alcohol's influence extended beyond the trenches. Winston Churchill, one of history's most iconic wartime leaders, had a famously complicated relationship with drink. He once quipped, "I have taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me," and he wasn't exaggerating. Churchill's daily consumption of whiskey, champagne and brandy was practically legendary, yet he commanded a nation through some of its darkest hours. For better or worse, alcohol seemed to accompany every great decision, every speech that inspired a beleaguered population, and every quiet moment of reflection. One wonders if a different man, without a glass in hand, might have viewed the Blitz in the same heroic light, or at least dictated memos with less panache. In the post-war world, alcohol maintained its social and economic prominence. Bars, breweries, wineries and distilleries became engines of commerce. Cocktails weren't just drinks, they were symbols of culture, creativity, and sometimes regret. Anyone who has endured a karaoke night knows that alcohol still plays a pivotal role in human behavior, inspiring courage, encouraging bad decisions, and occasionally producing stories that last a lifetime. Economies rely on it, governments tax it, and individuals, drunk, sober, or somewhere in between, continue to enjoy it for reasons as varied as survival, social bonding, and simple pleasure. Modern societies also reflect on booze as a tool of diplomacy and politics. State dinners often feature wine selections chosen to impress visiting dignitaries, and major treaties have been toasted into existence with champagne. Alcohol remains a language understood across cultures. Raise a glass, share a drink, and you communicate goodwill, celebration, or solidarity without a single word. The ritualistic power of alcohol has survived centuries, from clay mugs in Egypt to crystal flutes at the United Nations. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of modern booze is that humans are endlessly inventive when it comes to drinking. Craft breweries have exploded globally, mixologists are celebrated like chefs, and cocktail culture has become a field of artistry, experimentation, and occasionally reckless flair. Modern humans continue to build societies, economies, and memories around alcohol, proving that its role in civilization is far from diminished. And while we may now have regulation, hygiene, and scientific methods to control its production, the impulse remains unchanged. We drink, we celebrate, we err, and we tell stories. If history teaches us anything, it's that humans will go to extraordinary lengths for three things: food, shelter, and something to put in the glass. Booze has inspired literature, art, innovation, and rebellion. It has built empires, toppled governments, and even kept morale afloat when the world seemed hopeless. It isn't merely a drink, It is a companion of civilization, a catalyst for progress, and occasionally, the reason we wake up with regrets. So when we look back at beer rations on the pyramids, Greek symposiums, medieval alehouses, London's gin-fueled chaos, or American speakeasies, and then fast forward to modern cocktails, wartime rations and karaoke nights, one truth emerges clearly: alcohol has shaped the human story at every turn. It has comforted, corrupted, entertained, and inspired. Across continents and centuries, the human race has never been sober for long, and perhaps that's precisely why history is so delightfully colorful, absurd, and tipsy. Booze is more than a beverage, it is civilization in a glass. Long before we could send a tweet in under a second, humanity's idea of instant messaging involved extreme patience, lots of running, and a very nervous pigeon. Communication in the pre-telegraph world was slow, cumbersome, and frequently dramatic in unintended ways. If you wanted to let someone know that your crops were failing, your army was advancing, or that your cousin had married someone scandalous, you had to rely on a series of increasingly desperate methods: runners, carrier pigeons, smoke signals, or semaphore flags. Each method came with its own quirks, limitations, and potential for miscommunication. Let's start with runners and horseback messengers. The idea was simple: hire someone fast enough, give them a letter, and hope they didn't collapse halfway through. Ancient civilizations such as the Persians, Greeks, and Romans built elaborate courier networks, sometimes spanning hundreds of miles. These runners were the original marathoners, expected to sprint through rain, snow, and enemy territory, all while carrying a message that could literally change the fate of kingdoms. If a runner stumbled, got lost, or heaven forbid, decided a nearby inn looked more inviting than the road, the message might arrive hours, days, or weeks late. Imagine clocking your important news for 3 days and discovering your messenger took a scenic detour to sample local wine along the way. The ancient motto, "The early bird catches the worm," could have been rewritten as "The early runner hopefully doesn't get eaten by wolves." Carrier pigeons offered a different sort of convenience, mostly because pigeons, unlike humans, didn't need rest, food, or bathroom breaks. These birds were trained to fly back to a home coop, carrying tiny messages tied to their legs. On paper it sounded foolproof. Let the bird go and your message would arrive. In practice, pigeons had a sense of adventure entirely unaligned with human deadlines. They might stop at a tree for a snack, be chased by a hawk, or simply get distracted by a shiny object on the ground. And when the message didn't arrive, the sender had no way of knowing if it had been lost, eaten, or if the pigeon had just decided it preferred vacationing in a neighboring town. Even so, pigeons were widely relied upon in wars, city-states, and royal courts, often carrying secrets or urgent orders across great distances. They were fast but unpredictable, a feathery gamble on the outcome of history. Then there were smoke signals and semaphore systems, essentially the original visual text messages. Smoke signals were particularly popular among Native American tribes, some Asian civilizations, and even certain Mediterranean communities. A puff here, a long plume there, and theoretically you could transmit messages across valleys or mountain ridges. Semaphore flags worked similarly, using a standardized code to convey letters or words through the position of flags held by a person standing on a tower or hill. Both methods relied heavily on line of sight, good weather, and the recipient being awake and observant. A sudden fog or heavy rain could completely obscure a signal, leaving critical messages undelivered. And of course, smoke signals were visible to enemies, which sometimes led to very awkward confrontations. "Oh, you're signaling for help. Here's a catapult." Despite all their ingenuity, these early methods were slow and prone to hilarious errors. Messages often arrived partially garbled, misinterpreted, or far too late to be useful. For instance, a royal proclamation might reach its intended audience long after a rebellion had already begun, making the announcement simultaneously obsolete and comically irrelevant. Imagine a town receiving the news of a festival the week after it was supposed to happen, or worse, a declaration of war delivered after the enemy had already left town. History is full of these communication fails, the 19th century equivalent of sending a text to the wrong group chat and watching chaos unfold. Humor aside, these methods show just how desperate humans were to overcome distance. The human desire to connect, inform and manipulate events remotely drove the invention of increasingly elaborate systems, each one slightly better than the last, but none foolproof. Runners could collapse, pigeons could wander, smoke signals could vanish into clouds, and semaphore operators could misread a tilt of a flag. Yet society persisted, because waiting for news was often worse than hearing it late or partially wrong. The stakes were high, crops could fail, armies could advance, and political crises could spiral out of control, all because a single messenger tripped over a route. In essence, communication before the telegraph was an exercise in patience, risk, and human ingenuity. It required creative solutions, a dash of luck, and often the willingness to accept that your message might never arrive. And yet, people persisted. Civilization depended on it, wars were won or lost based on it, and gossip somehow spread even under the worst circumstances. So the next time you complain that your Wi-Fi is slow or your text didn't send, remember, before the telegraph, sending a message was basically signing up for a multi-day endurance race. If the pigeon didn't get distracted. Humanity's obsession with instant communication is timeless, but thankfully, we now have wires, satellites, and tiny glowing rectangles instead of marathon runners and overambitious birds. If communication before the telegraph was a marathon, Samuel Morse invented the roller coaster. One moment humanity was hobbling along with pigeons and smoke signals. The next, Morse code promised speed, efficiency, and a peculiar kind of finger gymnastics that would leave anyone exhausted before finishing a sentence. Samuel Morse, an American artist turned inventor, wasn't born with wires in his veins, at least not literally, but he had a vision, a system where messages could travel faster than any horse, pigeon, or flag ever could. The early 19th century was a time of sprawling nations and rapidly expanding commerce, but communication lagged behind. A letter from New York to Washington could take days, even weeks to arrive, and during that time the stock market could collapse, battles could be lost, and rumors could spiral wildly out of control. Morse saw the problem and realized that electricity, if harnessed correctly, could transmit messages across vast distances almost instantly. But electricity alone wasn't enough. You could have a wire stretching from one city to another, humming with potential. But if you didn't have a way to encode language into signals, it was just a fancy coat hanger for electric current. Enter Morse code, a system of dots and dashes representing letters, numbers, and punctuation. In essence, Morse turned the invisible flow of electrons into a language. One tap was a dot, two taps might be a dash, and with a sequence of dots and dashes you could spell out an entire message. To modernize, it seems elegant and simple. To anyone actually sending a message at top speed, it required Olympic-level finger gymnastics. Imagine texting, but every emoji, every exclamation mark, and every LOL had to be meticulously tapped out with perfect timing. A single mistap could turn help enemy approaching into heap enemy approaching. Not ideal in a crisis. Morse didn't invent the telegraph entirely on his own. He collaborated with Alfred Vail, an engineer who helped refine the hardware and improve the speed and reliability of the system. Together they built the first telegraph machine that could send pulses of electricity through a wire, interpret those pulses as dots and dashes, and print them out, or allow an operator to read them in real time. The concept sounds straightforward, but early demonstrations were filled with mishaps. Wires sparked, machines jammed, and operators frequently had to wrestle with the temperamental beasts to get a coherent message through. Despite the challenges, Morse and Vail's system worked, and when it did, it worked like magic. The genius of Morse code wasn't just in sending letters, it was in creating a universal language that electricity could carry, unlike spoken words which fade with distance, or written letters which require a physical handoff. Morse's system allowed information to leap across continents in mere seconds. Traders could update stock prices, Newspapers could receive breaking news faster than ever, and governments could issue orders to distant outposts almost instantly. It was transformative. For the first time, communication was no longer constrained by human or animal speed. It obeyed the laws of physics, and for Morse that was a game changer. Humorously, Morse code also introduced a new kind of suspense into communication. Unlike a text or email which can be glanced at instantly, a message in Morse arrives as a series of taps or clicks. Each dot and dash is a heartbeat, each pause a suspenseful cliffhanger. Imagine waiting for a single dot to reveal whether your town has been evacuated or if your lottery ticket won. It was like binge-watching a drama, one pixel or rather one pulse at a time. Operators had to develop both speed and stamina, their fingers flying across the key, ears attuned to the subtle variations in tone, and mistakes were inevitable. A dot missed here, a dash misread there, and suddenly your message about a celebratory parade becomes a warning about impending doom. Morse code also had a social and cultural impact beyond the purely practical. It became a kind of secret handshake among telegraph operators, a skill that commanded respect, and a language that connected people across cities, states, and eventually continents. In times of war or disaster, Morse was literally life-saving. Messages that once took weeks could now arrive in hours, allowing for coordination that would have been impossible in earlier eras. In a very real sense, Morse code shrank the world and foreshadowed the kind of instant global connectivity we now take for granted. And yet, despite its genius, Morse code retained a certain charm and humor. It was an invention that combined rigorous precision with absurdity, a language you could send through a wire, yet utterly useless without someone trained to decode it. Operators could send urgent news, business transactions, or love letters, all with the same series of dots and dashes. It was elegant, transformative, and occasionally terrifying, especially if you sent the wrong combination and accidentally ordered a dozen cows instead of a dozen boxes of ammunition. In the end, Samuel Morse's invention was more than just a technical marvel. It was a radical shift in human communication, a bridge between the slow, unreliable methods of the past and the instantaneous digital world of the future. Dots, dashes, and a little bit of patience changed the way humans shared information forever, turning the act of messaging from an ordeal into a science. And for those brave enough to operate the first machines, it was also a full-body workout for the fingers, a mental puzzle, and occasionally a recipe for hilarious miscommunication. Once Samuel Morse had figured out the dots, dashes, and finger gymnastics of Morse code, the next challenge was obvious. The message needed somewhere to travel. A genius code is only as useful as the wire or wires carrying it. Thus began the monumental task of laying the first telegraph lines, an enterprise that would stretch across cities, countrysides, and eventually oceans, connecting people in ways previously thought impossible. The first telegraph lines were relatively short, often linking two nearby towns, government offices, or railroad stations. But as the potential of Morse's invention became clear, ambitious engineers and investors began to dream bigger, lines spanning entire states, crossing mountains, and threading through forests and rivers. Each new line was an adventure or a disaster waiting to happen. Poles had to be erected at regular intervals, sometimes hundreds of miles apart. Each pole needed to withstand rain, snow, wind, and the occasional curious bear or cow. The wires themselves were delicate, prone to snapping in storms or being chewed by animals, and any interruption could render the line useless. Building a telegraph line wasn't a simple Sunday DIY project. Crews of men had to march across rough terrain, carrying heavy poles and spools of wire, sometimes digging holes by hand to anchor the posts securely. Imagine trudging through mud, heat, or snow, balancing a 20-foot pole on your shoulder, and trying not to trip over a rock or an unlucky raccoon. And then, of course, came the storms. Lightning could strike the very wires designed to carry communication, turning a technological marvel into a dangerous lightning rod. Men climbing poles in storms, basically the original extreme sports as one contemporary observer might have put it. was an understatement. Some poles were struck repeatedly, requiring daring repairs that tested both courage and common sense. Urban telegraph lines had their own set of challenges. City streets were narrow, bustling, and filled with curious onlookers. Erecting poles without blocking traffic or accidentally impaling a passerby required ingenuity. In some places, lines were threaded along building rooftops, creating a tangled skyline reminiscent of a giant medieval hairbrush. Residents would occasionally call the police, not because they were opposed to innovation, but because they feared the wires might electrocute them or their chickens. Early maintenance crews became part acrobat, part electrician, part magician, ensuring the system functioned despite human, animal, and natural interference. Crossing rivers, lakes, and eventually oceans required a whole new level of engineering audacity. Submarine cables, insulated and reinforced, were laid along the seabed to connect continents. The first successful transatlantic telegraph cable in 1858 allowed messages to leap from Europe to America in minutes, a feat previously unimaginable. Engineers faced challenges from storms, shifting currents, and the occasional curious whale. Every successful message sent across the Atlantic felt like a small miracle, a triumph of human ingenuity over the obstinate forces of nature. For the first time, someone in London could send a note to New York almost instantly, and vice versa, shrinking the world in ways that were both exhilarating and terrifying. Maintaining these lines became a full-time endeavor. Storms could bring wires down, trees could fall across lines, and animals could chew through cables. Telegraph companies developed specialized crews for repair work, often racing against time to restore communication. For towns and businesses dependent on the telegraph, a downed line was nothing short of a crisis. Some operators became legendary for their speed and skill in fixing outages, while others earned reputations for accidentally unplugging an entire town with a single misplaced wire. Despite the dangers and logistical headaches, the telegraph lines rapidly transformed society. Governments could send orders to distant outposts in record time. Businesses could coordinate across regions, and newspapers received updates on breaking events faster than ever before. The very concept of distance began to change. Cities that had previously felt isolated were now part of an interconnected network. The telegraph became the nervous system of nations, transmitting information with astonishing speed and precision. And of course, human ingenuity and humor found ways to shine even amid chaos. Telegraph lines were sometimes used for pranks, sending fake messages to unsuspecting recipients, or testing the system by transmitting nonsense strings of dots and dashes. Repair crews swapped stories about the most ridiculous outages, like a cow chewing through the cable, just as an important diplomatic message was being sent. For the first time, communication was no longer constrained by geography, yet it still retained all the unpredictability, drama, and occasional comedy of its pre-electric predecessors. By the end of the 19th century, telegraph lines crisscrossed continents, oceans, and cities, knitting the world together in an intricate lattice of wires. Each pole, each wire, and each daring repairman was a testament to human determination and ingenuity. The network wasn't perfect, but it was revolutionary. It transformed warfare, commerce, journalism, and even daily life, proving that when humans decide to connect, no storm, mountain, or distracted raccoon can stand in the way. In short, the first telegraph lines were both a marvel and a misadventure, combining technical brilliance, physical daring, and moments of absurdity. They laid the literal and figurative groundwork for modern communication, setting the stage for the telegraph to evolve from a local curiosity into the backbone of global messaging. Without these lines, Morse code would have been little more than a clever puzzle. With them, it became the first real step toward the instantaneous, connected world we now take for granted. Once the telegraph lines were strung across cities, countrysides, and oceans, someone had to actually use them, and that someone quickly became the telegraph office, the 19th century's hub of communication, gossip, and occasional chaos. These offices were far more than dull bureaucratic buildings. They were bustling centers of human activity, where news, business, and drama flowed faster than a carriage in a downpour. Essentially, They were the Twitter, WhatsApp, and Instagram of their day, only slower, pricier, and with a tendency to explode in sparks if you weren't careful. Walking into a telegraph office was like stepping into a storm of information. The floors were crowded with people pacing nervously, clutching envelopes and message forms, waiting for their turn to transmit a short but expensive message. Operators sat at telegraph keys, fingers flying, ears tuned to the clicks and buzzes of incoming dots and dashes. Outside, lines of customers often snaked around the building, impatient, anxious, and occasionally gossiping about the latest scandal, sporting event, or market news. It was organized chaos. The atmosphere practically screamed, everything important in the world is happening here, and you're about to pay $1 to tell someone about it. The cost of sending a telegraph message meant that every word counted. You didn't just write, "I love you." No, you wrote LYU, because each character cost money. People became masters of brevity, inventing a proto-Twitter shorthand that combined urgency, economy, and often complete ambiguity. A message could be as cryptic as ARRNYC 2A's 8 a.m., leaving the recipient to piece together meaning or panic based solely on context. And yet, despite the cost and ambiguity, telegraphs were relied upon for everything from business deals to love letters. A single telegraph could secure a stock trade, warn a distant relative of trouble, or even announce an engagement, though sometimes all of these messages arrived out of order, creating delightful historical chaos. Operators themselves were an elite class of professionals, trained to decode and transmit Morse code at incredible speeds. Their fingers flew across the keys with precision, and their ears were finely attuned to the subtle rhythms of dots and dashes. They were the unsung heroes of information, the ones who ensured that messages, whether urgent or trivial, arrived intact. A skilled operator could interpret a stream of code that would leave a layperson dizzy and confused, all while managing multiple lines and keeping a calm demeanor despite the constant stress. These offices required focus, dexterity, and nerves of steel, because a single mistap could result in minor chaos, miscommunication, or even an accidental declaration of war. Telegraph offices were also social spaces. People didn't just come to send messages, they came to hear news. In a world without instant newspapers, TV, or smartphones, the telegraph was the lifeline to the outside world. Business owners tracked market fluctuations, farmers checked crop reports, and families awaited updates from distant loved ones. Rumors, gossip, and urgent warnings traveled along the wires as eagerly as official messages. Standing in line wasn't just about waiting your turn, it was about staying connected, being in the know, and occasionally eavesdropping on the private lives of neighbors and friends. A message that might take days to arrive by horse now arrived in hours or minutes if you were lucky, and the thrill of waiting for a reply, nothing short of a suspenseful cliffhanger. The human drama of the telegraph office often rivaled the content of the messages themselves. Customers could grow impatient, arguing over priority, price, or delivery times. Children, curious and bored, would peek over shoulders to watch operators at work. Sometimes, office staff engaged in playful mischief, sending harmlessly cryptic messages to amuse themselves or to prank their regular customers. Imagine the delight of sending a mysterious, expensive string of dots and dashes that, when decoded, read something like, "The cat is planning a coup." Humorous mishaps like this were common, reminding everyone that even in an era of cutting-edge technology, humans were still, well, humans. Telegraph offices were also the stage for urgent communication and emergencies, which made them part lifeline, part drama theatre. In times of crisis, natural disasters, military actions, or urgent political decisions, people would rush to the offices, desperate to transmit or receive news. These were moments when every second mattered, and operators became critical players in the unfolding events. A misinterpreted code in such a situation could have dire consequences, but when handled correctly, a telegraph message could literally save lives. The combination of high stakes, human emotion, and technological novelty created a unique culture, tense, fast-paced, occasionally absurd, and endlessly fascinating. Ultimately, telegraph offices weren't just buildings, They were the heart of 19th century communication. They connected people across distances previously unimaginable, facilitated commerce, and allowed the spread of news and gossip at a speed that transformed society. They were also a reminder that even the most advanced technology is only as good as the humans operating it. And humans, of course, bring humor, drama, and a touch of chaos wherever they go. So the next time you complain that sending a dramatic text costs too much effort, or worse, that it might not be read immediately, remember this: in the 19th century, your dramatic text just cost you $1 and it might arrive tomorrow maybe. And yet somehow society thrived. Thanks to telegraph offices, gossip spread, businesses flourished, and humans discovered that speed, connectivity, and a little bit of human error make life far more interesting. By the mid-19th century, the telegraph had transformed cities and regions, but the true revolution came when it crossed oceans. The dream of instant communication was no longer limited to local lines. Now, people could send messages across continents, shrinking the globe in ways previously unimaginable. The invention of transatlantic telegraph cables was a feat of engineering audacity, human determination, and a fair share of trial, error, and occasional catastrophe. The first successful transatlantic cable, laid in 1858, connected Ireland to Newfoundland. Before this, a message from London to New York could take 10 days or more to travel by ship. After the cable, it could arrive in minutes, assuming it worked, which initially it did, for about 3 weeks. Early cables were delicate, prone to breaks, and difficult to repair. Engineers battled storms, frigid waters, and the technological limits of the era. Ships equipped to lay cable often had to navigate rough seas, deploy enormous reels of wire, and hope that nothing snapped. Sometimes they didn't even know if the cable was functioning until they received the first message, a moment equal parts triumph and terror. The impact of these cables was immediate and profound. Governments could communicate quickly with far-flung colonies and embassies, coordinating diplomacy, military maneuvers, and trade negotiations with unprecedented speed. Wars could now be managed on a global scale. Stock markets could react to news almost instantaneously, and urgent political messages could prevent crises, or in some cases create them. Imagine receiving an urgent directive from your king in Europe before your local advisor even finished breakfast. For the first time, decisions could be made in hours instead of weeks. But it wasn't all dry political maneuvering. The international telegraph also changed daily life in curious and amusing ways. Suddenly, people could send personal messages across the Atlantic, sharing news, gossip, or even confessions. The world's secrets no longer had the comfort of delay. Your embarrassing incident could reach a friend or relative abroad before you had time to recover or even reconsider. Suddenly, you could tell someone in London your scandalous story before they had a chance to ignore it, respond, or prepare a witty reply. The speed of connection transformed social dynamics, creating a new culture of instant or near-instant news long before digital messaging. Economically, the international telegraph reshaped trade. Merchants could confirm shipments, negotiate prices, and respond to market fluctuations almost in real time. Stock exchanges became more connected, news traveled faster than ever, and companies gained an unprecedented advantage by being first to react to global events. Of course, this also introduced a new source of stress. Waiting even a few minutes longer than your competitors could feel like an eternity. Telegraph operators became the linchpins of business, their fingers flying across keys to keep the flow of commerce moving smoothly, or at least as smoothly as a long underwater cable would allow. Military strategy too was revolutionized. Armies and navies could receive instructions from distant headquarters, coordinate troop movements, and share intelligence far more efficiently than ever before. Battles were planned with the knowledge that updates could arrive in hours rather than weeks, fundamentally changing the tempo of warfare. Mistakes still happened, lines broke, messages were misread, but the very existence of a transatlantic telegraph allowed for a level of coordination that had previously been impossible. It was a game changer for both empires and insurgents alike. The cultural impact of the international telegraph shouldn't be underestimated either. Newspapers could now report global news almost as it happened, creating the first semblance of a 24-hour news cycle. Events on one continent could ripple across the world, shaping public opinion, markets, and international relations. The world felt smaller, more interconnected, and more immediate. The same human tendency to gossip and overreact that once made telegraph offices lively now had a global stage. People marveled at the idea that they could quite literally reach across the ocean to communicate. There were technical challenges, of course. Underwater cables had to be insulated against the cold, pressure, and saltwater corrosion. Laying them required precision, patience, and occasional ingenuity, such as using gutta percha and natural rubber to coat wires. Crews sometimes had to battle storms at sea, and many cables failed before engineers perfected the technology. But each success was celebrated as a triumph of human ingenuity, a tangible step toward a world where distance was no longer an insurmountable barrier. Ultimately, the international telegraph reshaped humanity's relationship with distance, time, and information. Political, economic, and social networks could now operate on a scale and speed never before imagined. People, businesses, and governments became accustomed to thinking globally, acting quickly, and expecting instant or near-instant feedback. And while Morse code might have been the language of the wires, the stories, rumors, and dramas transmitted through them were unmistakably human. In short, the international telegraph made the world smaller, faster, and far more connected, often with hilarious consequences for social etiquette. It gave people the ability to share secrets, conduct business, and influence global events in minutes rather than months. It was the first real step toward a hyper-connected planet, proving that no ocean, mountain, or storm could stop humans from wanting to communicate, especially when there was a bit of drama involved. Long before the days of drones, satellites, and encrypted digital messaging, armies had one crucial limitation. Information traveled at the speed of a horse or a human runner. Battles were often decided not just by strength or strategy, but by which commander received news first. Enter the telegraph, a device that transformed military communication, turning panic into a rapid sequence of dots and dashes, strategy into a carefully tapped rhythm, and misfires into, well, hilarious historical anecdotes. The telegraph quickly became a critical tool for armies and navies, allowing commanders to send orders to distant units with unprecedented speed. Instead of waiting days or even weeks for couriers to arrive with instructions, a general could tap out a series of dots and dashes that would reach the front lines in minutes. The ability to coordinate troop movements, relay intelligence, and adjust tactics in real time fundamentally changed warfare. Armies could respond to threats faster, react to unexpected developments, and in theory prevent the chaos that had plagued campaigns for centuries. The telegraph gave leaders an almost superhuman ability to command forces spread across vast distances, though it also introduced new ways for disasters to occur. With great speed, however, came great risk. Misunderstandings and misinterpreted Morse messages could create chaos on the battlefield. A single misplaced dot or dash could transform a critical order into an accidental invitation to disaster. Commanders learned, sometimes the hard way, that the telegraph was only as reliable as the operators and the clarity of the message. A hurriedly tapped advance at dawn could become retreat at dawn, turning a well-planned offensive into an accidental fiasco. Soldiers on the receiving end often had to make split-second decisions with partial or garbled information, creating moments of panic, confusion, and occasional absurdity. One of the most amusing aspects of telegraph warfare was the human factor. Operators, often young men and women, were responsible for sending and receiving messages under immense pressure. They worked long hours in noisy, crowded offices, fingers flying across keys, ears straining to interpret the clicks and buzzes of incoming signals. A lapse in concentration, a misread dot here, a delayed dash there, could alter the course of a battle, or, at the very least, create a story for future historians. The telegraph operator became both hero and potential villain, wielding the power to save an army or accidentally start a panic, all while maintaining composure and avoiding eye contact with the general. War also highlighted the limitations of technology in extreme conditions. Telegraph lines could be severed by artillery fire, sabotaged by enemy troops, or disrupted by weather. Rain, ice, or mud could damage poles and wires, temporarily cutting off communication. Soldiers learned to improvise, sending couriers along the same routes the telegraph lines had run, sometimes restoring messages hours after they were supposed to arrive. It was a bizarre combination of cutting-edge technology and old-fashioned ingenuity, a mix of science and improvisation that often resulted in moments of both triumph and farce. In addition to operational messages, the telegraph became a vehicle for panic and misinformation. Armies receiving incomplete or poorly transmitted reports sometimes reacted as if the world were ending. A misinterpreted signal could prompt hasty retreats, unnecessary reinforcements, or premature celebrations. Commanders quickly discovered that sending a panic message with dots and dashes is like pressing reply all during a disaster, except slower, more expensive, and with the potential to confuse allies just as much as enemies. Yet, despite the risks, telegraphy was invaluable, allowing militaries to operate on a scale and speed never before possible. The telegraph also introduced new strategies that relied on speed and surprise. Armies could now feint movements, mislead opponents, and coordinate attacks across multiple locations. Naval fleets used telegraphs to relay sightings of enemy ships, giving admirals the ability to reposition forces rapidly. Intelligence gathering became far more precise, though always dependent on the skill of the operator and the integrity of the line. A savvy commander could leverage the telegraph to dominate, while a less careful one could find their plans unraveling due to a single misunderstood series of dots and dashes. Culturally, the telegraph in wartime had a lasting impact. Soldiers and civilians alike became aware of how quickly news could travel, fostering both excitement and anxiety. Families waiting for updates from the front lines experienced the thrill of almost instantaneous information, though this also amplified emotional swings. A letter that once would have taken weeks to arrive now came in minutes, revealing victories, defeats, or confusing directives, all with the rhythmic punctuation of Morse code. The speed of communication intensified the human drama of war, proving that information could be as decisive as bullets, or perhaps just as chaotic when mismanaged. In the end, the telegraph in war was both a miracle and a source of potential catastrophe. It allowed armies to coordinate with unprecedented efficiency, sped up intelligence, and shrank the world of military operations. But it also introduced new risks, miscommunication, panic, and the occasional historical blooper that seems absurd in retrospect. Commanders, operators, and soldiers all learned that technology was only part of the equation. Human judgment, training, and patience remained critical. In short, the telegraph transformed warfare by making communication fast, precise, and occasionally hilarious. Battles, campaigns, and even global politics were shaped by strings of dots and dashes, each one carrying the potential for victory, disaster, or a mix of both. Sending a panic message with dots and dashes truly was like pressing reply all during a disaster, except slower, more dangerous, and historically unforgettable. Once the telegraph lines stretched across continents and oceans, they didn't just serve armies and governments. They also transformed everyday life, shaping the way people consumed news, conducted business, and even expressed their most intimate emotions. The telegraph wasn't just a tool, it was a cultural phenomenon, a medium that rewrote the rules of communication and added a peculiar rhythm to human drama. For newspapers, the telegraph was nothing short of revolutionary. Suddenly, editors could receive reports from distant cities, foreign countries, and battlefields in mere hours rather than days or weeks. Breaking news traveled at a speed that made print media nearly instantaneous in the eyes of the public. Headlines once confined to local gossip now reported global events, from stock market fluctuations to royal scandals. Telegraph operators became unofficial reporters, their fingers tapping out stories that would later appear in print. A wire report of a storm in Ireland, a political upheaval in India, or a stock market crash in New York could reach readers faster than anyone could physically travel. The public became accustomed to a new pace of information, immediate, suspenseful, and occasionally sensationalized. Stock exchanges, too, underwent a dramatic transformation. Merchants and investors relied on telegraph messages to track prices, confirm trades, and react to market movements in real time. The telegraph introduced a new level of excitement and stress. A single message delayed or misread could cost fortunes, while a correctly received alert could yield immense profit. Traders became masters of brevity, using cryptic codes and shorthand to transmit instructions across wires. The stakes were high, and the pulse of the stock market began to mimic the rhythm of the telegraph itself, fast, erratic, and occasionally chaotic. The telegraph also reshaped personal correspondence in ways both charming and absurd. Love letters, once delivered by horse or courier over days or weeks, could now arrive in hours, letter by letter, dot by dot. Nothing says romance like a love letter delivered one dot at a time, with suspense built into every dash. Couriers no longer needed to brave the countryside. Instead, the Morse code operator's fingers became the vehicle of sentiment. Admirers and suitors learned patience and brevity, condensing expressions of love and longing into compact messages. There was something undeniably poetic and slightly torturous about awaiting a romantic message transmitted in electrical pulses, each one carrying both hope and anxiety. Gossip thrived in this new era. Local scandals, social missteps, and absurd incidents could now travel far beyond the town where they occurred. One could share news of an embarrassing slip at a ball, a sudden engagement, or a ridiculous duel across hundreds of miles. The telegraph turned otherwise private incidents into global curiosities, at least within the circles connected by wires. Overdramatic announcements, once the province of town criers or letters, now carried a new weight and urgency. A simple arrival of king could spark speculation, excitement, or mild panic in distant towns, all because someone pressed the keys a little too enthusiastically. Culturally, the telegraph introduced a new sense of anticipation. Unlike letters that took days to arrive, telegraph messages unfolded in real time. Each tap of the key delivered a fragment of information, creating suspense as recipients decoded the pulses. People developed a keen ear for the rhythm of Morse code, associating certain sequences with good news, bad news, or an urgent warning. Reading a message wasn't passive, it was an event, a tiny drama that played out in minutes. The telegraph added a performative element to communication, turning simple facts into emotional experiences. Humor, of course, found its way into telegraph culture. Operators and recipients alike occasionally misinterpreted messages, creating unintended comedy. A message intended to instruct a relative to buy stock could become buy socks if a dot was misplaced, prompting bewildered actions and sometimes laughter. Entire newspapers occasionally ran corrected telegraph messages as amusing footnotes, reminding everyone that even cutting-edge technology could be fallible. The combination of speed, human error, and high stakes made the telegraph a rich source of both drama and amusement. In addition, the telegraph affected social etiquette and expectations. People came to expect rapid responses, creating a new form of impatience. Waiting a day for a reply was suddenly considered archaic. This shift influenced everything from business practices to courtship rituals. As society adapted to a world where information traveled at the speed of electricity rather than horse or foot, the telegraph not only connected people physically but also emotionally, accelerating both excitement and anxiety. Ultimately, telegraph culture was about connection, immediacy, and drama. It transformed newspapers, stock markets, and personal relationships, while also creating a space for humor, suspense, and occasional mischief. The telegraph allowed humanity to experience the thrill of near-instant communication long before phones or the internet existed, demonstrating that speed and connectivity have always been as much about social interaction as about technology itself. In short, the telegraph didn't just send messages, it sent emotions, intrigue, and gossip across wires. It connected governments, businesses, and hearts, creating a world that was faster, more informed, and delightfully unpredictable. Nothing captured the quirks of human communication better than this network of dots and dashes, where every pulse carried a story, a secret, or a touch of suspense. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the telegraph, once the pinnacle of instantaneous communication, began to feel a bit like that old uncle at family gatherings, impressive in his heyday, but slowly overshadowed by flashier newcomers. Enter the telephone, a device that allowed people to speak directly to one another without translating thoughts into dots and dashes. Suddenly, the painstaking art of Morse code seemed quaint, and the days of waiting for a telegraph office to open, filling out forms and paying by the character were numbered. The telephone's arrival didn't immediately make the telegraph obsolete. For decades, both technologies coexisted, each with its own niche. Telegrams were still faster for long-distance written communication, particularly between businesses, governments, and across oceans. But for everyday chatter, personal messages, and urgent matters requiring nuance, the telephone had a clear advantage. People could actually hear each other. Tone, emotion, hesitation, and sarcasm, all of which are impossible to transmit via Morse code, suddenly became part of communication. There was no need to decode your grandmother's cryptic HLU message. You could just ask her directly, and maybe even hear her sigh. Telegraph companies tried to adapt. Some branched into teletype machines, essentially typewriters connected by telegraph lines, allowing messages to be typed and transmitted electronically. Businesses adopted these systems to streamline correspondence, particularly for orders, shipping notices, and urgent updates. Meanwhile, governments leveraged telegraph networks for diplomacy, war, and postal communication, but even these official uses were gradually shrinking in relevance. The rapid expansion of telephony and later fax machines offered immediacy, flexibility, and human warmth that the rigid telegraph could never match. Even as the telegraph's role in daily life faded, its legacy remained enormous. The very idea of instantaneous communication reshaped human expectations. People became accustomed to rapid responses, global news arriving almost instantly, and networks connecting continents. Modern digital messaging, from email to text messaging, from Slack to WhatsApp, is built on the principles first demonstrated by telegraphy. Send a message, wait for it to arrive, and marvel at the near-instant connectivity. Morse code may have looked like a series of dots and dashes, but it set the template for a world where information could flow across vast distances in real time. Interestingly, the decline of the telegraph also introduced a new type of nostalgia and humor. Historians and technophiles alike marvel at the quirks of telegraph culture. Operators who could transmit hundreds of words per minute, the suspense of waiting for a dot and dash love letter, and the occasional catastrophic misread message that upended events. The telegraph may have died, one might joke, but somewhere in the cloud your ancestors are still judging your Wi-Fi speed. It's an amusing reminder that human impatience with communication isn't new. It just now manifests in buffering circles and failed video calls rather than tangled wires and misinterpreted Morse code. The telegraph's decline was also tied to technological consolidation and infrastructure. Maintaining telegraph lines was expensive, labor-intensive, and increasingly unnecessary in the face of superior alternatives. Poles had to be replaced, cables repaired, and operators trained, all at considerable cost. When telephones and radio communication offered faster, cheaper, and more versatile options, the economic incentive to continue expanding telegraph networks dwindled. Lines were gradually decommissioned, offices closed, and the once bustling hubs of social, business, and political activity became relics. Some buildings still stand today, preserved as museums or historical landmarks, quietly reminding us of an era when human ingenuity turned electricity into the first real instant messaging system. Culturally, the telegraph's decline didn't erase its influence. Novels, newspapers, and memoirs of the 19th and early 20th centuries frequently referenced telegrams, highlighting both the suspense and drama they introduced into life. The dramatic punctuation of stop in telegrams became a stylistic quirk, and the phrase "stop the presses" owes some of its urgency to telegraphic communication. The psychological impact of sending and receiving messages almost instantly, long before phones, let alone the internet, reshaped how people thought about distance, time, and connection. It instilled a sense that the world was smaller, faster, and far more interconnected, even if your message still had to brave a stormy night to reach the next town. Ultimately, the telegraph didn't vanish quietly. It evolved into a foundational layer for modern communication. It taught society that messages could travel at the speed of electricity, that immediacy matters, and that humans will always find ways to connect, sometimes efficiently, sometimes hilariously, and occasionally at great expense. While telegrams may now be museum pieces, the spirit of Morse code lives on in every ping, notification, and text message. It's a reminder that the drive to communicate instantly is as old as electricity itself, and that even if your Wi-Fi is slow, your ancestors would have understood your frustration perfectly. In short, the telegraph may have bowed out gracefully in favor of telephones, fax machines, and digital messaging, but its influence is undeniable. It shrank the world, accelerated human interaction, and set the stage for the hyper-connected society we inhabit today. And somewhere in the cloud, those ancestors of telegraph operators are probably rolling their eyes, judging your Wi-Fi speed, and thinking, kids these days, and their lazy dots and dashes.